Hello, welcome. Now this video today is about uh, a speech that I was meant to give at the Saving Scotland anti-lockdown, anti-mask rally on the 5th of September. The rally outside Holyrood, Holyrood Parliament in Edinburgh. And it was a very interesting day. There's some very good speakers there. Professor Dolores Cahill, world-renowned immunologist. Professor Richard Enos from the University of Edinburgh, geneticist, biologist by trade, and a doctor and cardiologist, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, all discussing various aspects of the science regarding the COVID-19 and the government's response, the UK government and the world government's response to it, and pointing out why they thought they were wrong. And I discussed this on the Torino YouTube channel with Rowan Croft a few days ago on the 7th, Monday the 7th in the evening. Discuss some of the details of the speakers. You can go there and listen to what I had to say. Now, I was down to speak, to do a little speech, but unfortunately, there was it was shut down early, the rally, by the police, and they were getting a bit pushy about the people being gathered there, and they shut it down. So I never got the chance. So I thought I would try to do my speech here, but I'll give it a little bit of extra background, which I think's useful. And just as a side note, the organiser, or one of the organisers of the rally in Edinburgh, the Holyrood Parliament, was Paddy Hogg, and he's been subsequently arrested and charged by the police for his involvement in that. And interestingly enough, Dolores Cahill, on her return back to Dublin after the event in Edinburgh, was detained for 3 hours regarding there was a demand for some sort of form of track and trace sort of location form that the airport demanded. She didn't give it, and she wasn't allowed to leave eventually. So it shows you the authorities are not enjoying people speaking out against the government narrative. And, essentially, the risk to people from COVID-19 has been, you can read in many sources that it's around about 99.9% of people will be fine. And yet, society's in lockdown, the economy's burning, and jobs are being lost. Mental health is rocketing. Mental ill health is skyrocketing. Operations, hospital appointments have been cancelled. The waiting lists are huge. And now Nicola Sturgeon has said people can't meet. People from other households. It's just doom and gloom. And anyways, my speech was on the role of psychology and psychologists within the UK government, and some of the same people advised the Scottish government as well. And I think it's quite insidious what is happening in the role of psychology on the UK population, how they're using it to manipulate and coerce and make us fearful. And historically, and history I love looking back at history for various totalitarian and fascist regimes, how psychology has been used and applied. And this is a very interesting, if I can find it. This was a book, Brave New World Revisited. It was an essay that was written by Aldous Huxley a few years later after he wrote The Brave New World. And I'll just quote what he writes in here. So these are just things to bear in mind before I go to do my speech, what I was going to say on the 5th of September in Edinburgh. Since Hitler's day, the armoury of technical devices at the disposal of the would-be dictator has been considerably enlarged, as well as the radio, the loudspeaker, the moving picture camera, and the rotary press. The contemporary propagandist can make use of television to broadcast the image as well as the voice of his client, and can record both image and voice on spools of magnetic tape. Thanks to technological progress, Big Brother can now be almost as omnipresent as God. Nor is it only on the technical front that the hand of the would-be dictator has been strengthened. Since Hitler's day, a great deal of work has been carried out in those fields of applied psychology and neurology, which are the special province of the propagandist, the indoctrinator and the brainwasher. In the past, these specialists in the art of changing people's minds were empiricists. By a method of trial and error, they had worked out a number of techniques and procedures which they used very efficiently, without, however, knowing precisely why they were effective. Today, the art of mind control is in the process of becoming a science. The practitioners of the science know what they are doing and why. And he goes on. He says, intellectuals are the kind of people who demand evidence and are shocked by logical inconsistencies and fallacies. They regard oversimplification as the original sin of the mind and have no use for the slogans, the unqualified assertions and sweeping generalizations which are the propagandist's stock in trade. All effective propaganda, Hitler wrote, must be confined to a few bare necessities and then must be expressed in a few stereotyped formulas. These stereotyped formulas must be constantly repeated, for only constant repetition will finally succeed in imprinting an idea upon the memory of the crowd. Philosophy teaches us to feel uncertain about the things that seem to us self-evident. Propaganda, on the other hand, teaches us to accept as self-evident matters about which it would be reasonable to suspend our judgment or feel doubt. The aim of the demagogue is to create social coherence under his own leadership, but as Bertrand Russell has pointed out, systems of dogma without empirical foundations, such as scholasticism, Marxism, and fascism, have the advantage of producing a great deal of social coherence among their disciples. The demagogic propagandist must therefore be consistently dogmatic. All his statements are made without qualification. There are no greys in his picture of the world. Everything is either diabolically black or celestially white. In Hitler's words, the propagandist should adopt a systematically one-sided attitude towards every problem that has to be dealt with. he must never admit that he might be wrong, or that people with a different point of view might even be partially right. Opponents should not be argued with, they should be attacked, shouted down, or if they become too much of a nuisance, liquidated. The resonance of that to what's going on today, with government scientists ignoring scientists with other viewpoints, and people being censored, and people being arrested, and slogans being used by the government: stay at home, save the NHS, save lives, the rule of six, and all the other slogans that they come up with. These are tried and tested methods from other totalitarian fascist regimes. So this is where we're at with that. I think we can be sure of that. Now, as I said, my speech was got to be about the role of psychologists, and the psychologists, the SpyB sub-team of SAGE in the UK government, and I think it would be useful, firstly, to give a little bit of background of the ethics of the British Psychological Society, because the British Psychological Society do have a code of ethics and practice guidelines. Now, you have to keep this in mind when I do my speech later. Just think of what I'm going to say now, what SpyB and psychologists are doing. So this is from the BPS Code of Ethics document, and other documents on the BPS, British Psychological Society website. Statement of values. Psychologists value the dignity and worth of all persons with sensitivity to the dynamics of perceived authority or influence over persons and peoples, and with particular regard to people's rights. In applying these values, psychologists should consider privacy and confidentiality, respect, communities and shared values within them, the impacts on the broader environment, living or otherwise, issues of power, consent, self-determination, the importance of compassionate care, including empathy, sympathy, generosity, openness, distress, tolerance, commitment, and courage. Psychologists must accept appropriate responsibility for what is within their power, control, or management. Aware of responsibility ensures that the trust of others is not abused. The power of influence is properly managed, and that duty towards others is always paramount. Psychologists value their responsibilities to persons, peoples, to the general public, and to the profession and science of psychology, including the avoidance of harm. Remember that, including the avoidance of harm, and the prevention of misuse or abuse of their contribution to society. Remember that too. In applying these values, psychologists should consider professional accountability, responsible use of their knowledge and skills, and respect for the welfare of non-humans and the living world, and potentially competing duties. Psychologists value honesty, probity, accuracy, clarity, and fairness in their interactions with all persons and peoples, and seek to promote integrity in all facets of their scientific and professional endeavours. In applying these values, psychologists should consider honesty, openness, and candour, accurate, unbiased representation, fairness, and avoidance of exploitation and conflicts of interest. And on the topic of safeguarding, they say, safeguarding means protecting people's health, well-being and human rights, and enabling them to live free from harm, abuse and neglect. Physical abuse is the physical force or mistreatment of one person by another, or one group by another, I would add, which may or may not result in actual physical injury. Staying at home and dying because you're too fearful to go out. This could include hitting, poisoning, deprivation of food, water, or liberty. Psychological/emotional abuse is behaviour that is psychologically harmful or inflicts mental distress by threat, humiliation, or other verbal, non-verbal conduct. This may include threats, blaming, controlling, intimidation, or coercion, amongst other things. Financial abuse is actual or attempted theft, fraud, or burglary. It is the misappropriation or misuse of money, property, benefits, material goods, or other asset transactions which the person did not or could not consent to, or which were invalidated by intimidation, coercion, or deception. This may include exploitation, embezzlement, withholding pension or benefits, or pressure exerted around wills, property, or inheritance. Institutional abuse is the mistreatment or neglect by a regime or individuals in settings which people who may be at risk reside in or use. The government's an institution. Institutional abuse may occur when routine systems and regimes result in poor standards of care, poor practice and behaviours, inflexible regimes and rigid routines which violate the dignity and human rights of the adults and place them at risk of harm. May occur within a culture that denies, restricts or curtails privacy, dignity, choice and independence. Involves the collective failure of a service provider or an organisation to provide safe and appropriate services, and includes a failure to ensure the necessary preventative and or protective measures are in place. Neglect is the persistent failure to meet basic physical and or psychological needs. Rule 6. Stay at home, save lives. Don't see anyone. Wear a mask. It may involve a parent or carer failing to provide emotional adequate food, clothing and shelter, or failing to provide or unresponsive to basic emotional needs, or failing to protect from physical harm. Basic emotional needs. Social distancing, wear masks, stay at home, save lives. That's the British Psychological Society, just a snippet of their guidelines on ethics. Just before I do the speech that I was going to do, I'll mention a few things from what SpyB are actually doing in a little bit of detail. Then this is from Mike Robinson, who is from UK Column. So SpyB, they have a bit of history. A lot of the psychologists attached to SpyB. They're known as the Behavioural Insights Team, and they were involved a few years ago with implementing psychological treatment in job centres for people who are unemployed. And essentially, it was the psychopathologization of unemployment. And there was a great uproar amongst many people, a lot in the left-wing sphere of activism, but across the board. But the British Psychological Society, again, were quiet, as were many psychotherapy organisations. And they were complicit in it, because making people go for psychological treatment for their unemployment is against human rights, I think. And so SpyB, it is the full name for it was the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour. SpyB takes no part in discussion about which interventions are effective in dealing with COVID-19 pandemic or their timing. The group is tasked with providing advice on how to help people to adhere to the interventions which government demands. And they wrote in their document, SpyB, there are 9 broad ways of achieving behaviour change. They write education, persuasion, incentivisation, coercion, enablement, training, restriction, environmental restructuring and modelling. The advice given by SpyB is immediately aggressive, and they wrote, a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. And they write, the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased amongst those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. And another option for managing behaviour which SpyB recommends is the harnessing of social disapproval. Social disapproval from one's community, they write, can play an important role in preventing antisocial behaviour or discouraging failure to enact pro-social behaviour. This needs to be carefully managed to avoid victimisation, scapegoating and misdirected criticism. But it should be recognised that in order to make use of disapproval, the government has to get into the community in question to stir up that disapproval. And SpyB recommended using the media to do this. They recommended that the media is used, the mainstream media, to increase a sense of personal threat, to increase a sense of responsibility to others, and to promote positive messaging around actions. So you get the gist. You get the gist. Ramping up fear, creating a culture of shaming, using the media. Bear in mind the ethics. Now, I'm going to read my prepared speech that I was going to do on Saturday, but it was closed down, and then I've got the chance, so here goes. We have a lot to learn from history and the great Russian writer and critic of Soviet communism, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, especially in our present era of the COVID-19 brave new normal. In his address to Harvard University in 1978, Solzhenitsyn said, open quotes, many of you have already found out, and others will find out in the course of their lives, that truth eludes us if we do not concentrate our attention totally on its pursuit. But even while it eludes us, the illusion of knowing it still lingers and leads to many misunderstandings. Also, truth is seldom pleasant, it is almost invariably bitter. There is some bitterness in my speech too, but I want to stress that it comes not from an adversary, but from a friend. Close quotes. Likewise, when it comes to our era of the COVID-19 brave new normal, there are many bitter truths we have to face now. One such bitter truth is that the UK and Scottish Government are using applied behavioural psychology, breaking ethical guidelines for psychologists, to deliberately ramp up fear in the population. A group of psychologists called SpyB of SAGE have been tasked with advising the UK and Scottish governments how to get people to adhere to COVID-19 restrictions. From their document, which is freely available on the UK government website, it says, open quotes, a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. The perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. Close quotes. The psychologists of SpyB and the UK government knew fear alone would not be enough. Therefore, SpyB suggested to use and promote social disapproval for their desired behaviours, to consider enacting legislation to compel required behaviours, and to consider the use of social disapproval for failure to comply. The result of this coercion, fear-mongering and shame-mongering, contrary to the ethical guidelines for psychologists, has seen a massive increase in mental ill health and suicides. The elderly and other people are too scared to leave home, and many people have died and are dying at home because they were and are too afraid to seek medical help for non-COVID-19 illness. It has resulted in young children becoming traumatized by seeing a whole society of people with masks on and treating each other like biohazards. And now, Nicola Sturgeon, Chief Mammy, muzzles our school children and spies on them at lunchtime to make sure pupils are wearing masks in shops. Even Network Rail have signs telling people to socially distance to stop the spread of bacteria and viruses. These have since been taken down after I complained, by the way. What has bacteria and other viruses got to do with social distancing and COVID-19? It's the totalitarian creep. That's why they put bacteria and viruses in those signs. This is all going on in the British Psychological Society, the regulator of psychologists, the Health and Care Professions Council, psychologists, mental health charities and so-called political activists are completely silent about this deliberate psychological torture of our society and our children. This is unacceptable. This is complicity. The data and the science are clear. COVID-19 is not the threat or dangerous pandemic where we have to lock down society and where we have to destroy the economy. COVID-19 is an excuse to take away our freedom and liberty. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is a lack of courage. There was no lack of courage on Saturday at the rally, I might add. Historically, this has also been a problem. In a critical remark and warning to the West, Alexander Solzhenitsyn said in his Harvard address, open quotes, "A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, each government, each political party, and, of course, in the United Nations. Should one have to point out that from ancient times, declining courage has been considered the beginning of the end." Those quotes. Let this not be the beginning of the end of democracy and freedom in Scotland. In our COVID-19 brave new normal, let us not ignore the warnings of the past and the historical events where totalitarian regimes came to flourish. A totalitarian medical technocracy is now being forced upon us. Let us be courageous. Let us be brave. We have to do this for our children and grandchildren. If we do not, they will never forgive us. And we will never be able to forgive ourselves. Thanks for listening. See you next time.